All right, here we go. Zoom. Once we understand that hip hop is protest music, or protest culture, we have to understand why that's the case. Well, it's the case because those who created hip hop, those who birthed the culture, have always been victimized by society writ large. They always had to have something to fight against. What is protest? Protest is objection in a statement, in an action against some inequity or some rule or some established norm that does violence on somebody else. So hip hop has been always about ensuring that if something wrong is done against somebody else, someone within the culture was going to stand up and respond and do so viscerally and actively, and do so oftentimes in hip hop through the voice, through word, through song. This episode's title is Using Your Pedagogy as Protest. The concept behind that is that pedagogy, the science of teaching and learning, should be about protesting against wrongs that have been done. Done to who? Done to young people. The concept of pedagogy as protest is a part of hip hop. It's about identifying any instance, any situation, any norm, any curriculum, any standard that does not allow young folks to be fully actualized, and utilizing how we teach as a pushback against that thing. In this era where communities are rallying against police brutality, where folks are protesting for the value of Black lives, where across the globe there are movements to push back against draconian laws and structures and rules that do not do well by certain segments of the population, those of us who teach have to be able to join in that movement. Where the world is shifting and bending towards the arc of justice and equity, that we cannot, as teachers, be absolved from that conversation. And the only way that you can engage in that conversation, where you can be a part of a movement toward what is right in the world, is to think about your teaching as an opportunity to be equitable. To think about your practice in the classroom as a march, as a protest. To think about the art of teaching and learning as a movement towards social justice. Because that's what hip hop teaches us to do. Any significant movement in our time has always had music as the backdrop. In the 50s and 60s, there was the blues. And in the late 70s, 80s, and in the present, it is hip hop. What are we going to do to be able to use hip hop as a soundtrack to our protest in the classroom? It may not be through music, it may be through culture. So if hip hop music is in the backdrop of every social movement, then hip hop culture must be in the backdrop of every pedagogy of protest. And that comparison and that connection is so important for educators to understand. Now some may ask, Dr. Emden, what are we protesting against? How do we identify what it is that we're pushing back against? The first step in enacting a pedagogy of protest is doing not just a self-audit through the knowledge of self, but an institutional audit to see what is harming young people. And we don't find out what is harming young people that we're gonna push back against until we engage in and with young folks. So you must, in the words of hip hop, cipher, or in an academic term, cogenerative dialogue, engage in conversation with young people about how they're experiencing the teaching and learning experience. Identify from that dialogue what is harming them, what is impacting them negatively, and then through your teaching, work towards pushing back against what is harming young folks. So our pedagogy is protesting against the things that are harming young people as articulated by young people. Just as hip hop constructs music against what is wrong in the world by experiencing what is going on in the world and pushing back against it. The hip hop in this process is in the style of the protest. Traditional protest takes on very specific norms. It's quiet marching. Hip hop protest, hip hop pedagogy as protest is visceral, it is loud, it's unapologetic, and it is getting to the essence and core of what is wrong. Think back to hip hop like We Gonna Be Alright by Kendrick Lamar, an unapologetic screaming out that in the midst of what's challenging, we will be whole. That was protest. It was protest against conditions in society that said that Black and brown bodies should be broken. Think about Fight the Power by Public Enemy that was rallying against the treatment of black bodies and brown bodies in urban communities in the midst of a crack era. And it was loud and unapologetic. And so our pedagogy of protest is in the same way. That we are loudly against what harms young people after we diagnose the conditions of our environment and identify what it is that is impeding upon the full freedom of young people, the full freedom to learn, the full freedom to engage, the full freedom to feel as though school is for them. The young folks might say, like, what is harming us is how you treat us. And a pedagogy of protest then says, through how I teach you, I will ensure that I'm teaching you with love and with care. So I'm greeting you in the morning and asking how you're doing. And I'm pausing in the middle of my lecture to see if you fully understand where I'm going. And I'm creating opportunities outside of class, on Zoom, etc., for not just delivering content, but for us to be socially engaged so I can share with you that I care. And those kind of acts are protests. They are protests against the norms of schooling that are hyper-focused on content without focusing on the emotion and the heart and the self-actualization of young folks. Sometimes the best pedagogy of protest is the pedagogy of love, because love pushes back against the kind of schooling that extracts love and only focuses on the delivery of information. The chief thing that we protest against, though, is apathy. It's a culture of apathy that has permeated all schools across this country. And a pedagogy of protest is one that centers emotion and the expression of emotion, just like hip hop does. There's no hip hop track that does not have emotion soaking in it. Like, it's not soaking in how you feel and where I'm from. And so what a pedagogy of protest is predicated on is fighting apathy by being an educator who, once they know themselves, operates in the classroom with full emotion. This idea of wearing your emotion on your sleeve as being a detriment to good pedagogy is a falsehood. A pedagogy of protest centers the emotion, centers the love, centers the joy, and centers not anger, but centers righteous indignation against anything that is against the student's full wholeness. Family, we must recognize that to teach in this era, in this season, is to understand that the classroom is not a physical space, but also a digital one. That it's not just a digital space that has particular populations coming to meet with you, but rather that you have an audience that is larger than you could ever imagine. Every teacher in this moment who understands the significance of this work, who carries a hip-hop philosophy, must understand that if pedagogy is protest and protest must be public, then I must have a presence in the public. There is no space for an educator to be timid in this era. Start that blog, start that podcast, start that social media page so you can share with folks what is going on in the classroom as it affects young folks, but also have insight into what's going on in the educational landscape that you can provide to the world. A lot of the decisions being made for teachers, about teachers, are from folks who have not set foot in the classroom, who don't understand your everyday experience. You must protest against the colonization of the craft of teaching by putting yourself in the gap to be a part of public discourse and share what you're experiencing, what you know, and what you're hearing from young folks. Pedagogy as protest applies to what you share with the world as well. What brought us here today was George Floyd, and the fact that there was a knee placed on his neck that killed him. And we all can say collectively, we don't like that, and we would never do that. But just as important is the metaphor of George Floyd. A knee on the neck of a black man that physically murdered him is just as dangerous when you have a metaphorical knee on the neck of black folks who built this city, whose voices have not been heard. But we also have to condemn ourselves about the looks that we give black faces as they walk down Broadway, as though they're criminals first. So even if we celebrate or we demonize a murder that we saw, we also have to ask ourselves, how do we murder joy? How do we murder voice? How do we murder each other's voices? Because sometimes that's more egregious than a physical death. An emotional and psychological and spiritual death, where you bought a home somewhere and you don't feel welcome, when voices even in this crowd are pushed to the margins, and those are the ones we should be advocating for, that is just as egregious as murder. So
but no justice for smiles, no justice for acknowledgement, no justice for humanity, no justice for profiling, no justice for silencing. And when we leave here today, this is definitely about George Floyd, but it's also about all our collective voices. And we push back by always saying, no justice,
no peace.
No justice,
no peace.
No justice,
no peace.